He took 13 lives and then lost his own. So what led to this young man losing control and lashing out with such murderous rage? Tonight, in search of the answer to that question, we'll take you several places. But perhaps the most intriguing of all, a little place called Harrison in the southern part of the United States. This is a story about teaching people how to hate and to kill. It has ramifications far beyond Aramoana, New Zealand, or Harrison, Arkansas, where the other key figure in this story lives. Tonight's report is about murder by mail order.
David Gray grew up in Port Chalmers near Dunedin. He was a lonely, alienated person who had little in common with his older brother or sister. Classmates and teachers at school remembered David Gray as an unusual boy.
He was strange at school. He sort of stayed away from everybody and didn't bother with anybody, and he was what we would call weird then.
I do remember one time when I tried to make an issue of something and cornered him, and he completely flew off the handle. I remember he kicked me and screamed and yelled. So I learnt never to confront him because he could not cope with that.
David Gray's teenage years were spent in and around Port Chalmers, but the introverted boy left few happy memories. He was a poor high school student and only ever held down one job as a farm labourer.
Both David Gray's parents died. His father in 1978, his mother 6 years later. David, in his 20s, became even more morose and withdrawn, even though by then he'd moved to this idyllic coastal hideaway, Aramoana. Neighbours here realised they had a puzzling character in their midst.
But there was something about him that you would never read about. Who read all the literature in the bloody world. You would never. He was the most devastating fella.
Creepy. He's a loony.
In January 1990, there was a tense scene between Gray and a young assistant in this Dunedin bookshop in which Gray produced a gun. For shop owner Bill Brosnan, this confirmed what he'd long feared about David Gray.
I thought he was capable of killing people. Like, in my wildest imagination, I wouldn't have thought it was that many, but I had a sense of foreboding because several things he said to me, like suggested one day last year that I firebomb some of my competitors, and I just thought that he was a classic case of a guy living alone, chip on his shoulder, all the time in the world, access to firearms, and I thought it was a potentially explosive situation.
Police investigated this incident and visited David Gray in Aramoana, but no charges were laid against him. Guns, loneliness and anger. In the house that bore the name of the Norse god of war, a time bomb was ticking. David Gray had become a recluse. A number of people tried to befriend him, but he rejected them. After the incident with the gun in the bookshop, it would be several months before Gray finally lost control. But behind the sand dunes of Aramoana, the ingredients for mass murder were being quietly assembled. Half a world away from Aramoana are some astonishing clues to what happened next. In the United States, hate groups and white supremacists have in recent years enjoyed a small but fanatical revival. While David Gray was growing up a bitter and lonely youth in Port Chalmers, New Zealand, neo-Nazi preachers in America were sending a clear message to poor losers there.
America is cursed because we've allowed these antichrist Jews into our midst.
In the 1970s, out of the same stable as the white supremacists came a group called the Survivalists. These were serious right-wingers who believed you had to make practical preparations for Armageddon. Some survivalists formed themselves into armed compounds and made these home movies of themselves preparing to repel the Russians.
Anyone that thinks the way they think and have the firepower that they have, I'm definitely concerned about them.
Survivalists loved weapons. The more powerful, the better. They loved to buy the gear to make them look like commandos. This was a cult raised on fear. Here in their own specialty stores is the stuff that survivalist dreams are made of. For the armchair variety, gung-ho T-shirts. For the moderately serious, practice grenades. For the real survivalists, the wherewithal to make bombs, right down to the fuse wire. And for those who really want to create mayhem, the literature, which tells you how to kill people. The survivalist movement has a high priest of hate, whose writings and videos form the hard core of what American policemen call mayhem literature.
It would be the best way to put the whole Russian army out of commission as far as their transport was concerned. I mean,
his name is Kurt Saxon. In this video, he's explaining how to make a bomb you can place in the fuel tank of an enemy's car.
That gas is just sloshing like crazy, and this stuff is going to be bouncing all over the place and hitting the sides and the top of the gas tank. And so once it's dry enough, then that Russian is history.
Saxon, a man who says he's murdered several enemies without being caught, lost the fingers on his left hand through a bit of amateur bomb making like this in the 60s. Kurt Saxon's biggest sellers are his books, a series called The Poor Man's James Bond. These books, which have sold some 80,000 copies, are crammed with useful information for survivalists. How to turn an ordinary rifle into a machine gun. How to make poisons and how much you need for a lethal dose. How to blow someone to pieces with a bomb made out of an object as simple as a phone index or book.
His manuals and his books are good for only one thing, that's killing cops and firemen.
American specialists on the art of terrorism, like Neil Livingston, are adamant. Kurt Saxon is a remote control killer. In cases of violent death, accidents involving bombs, and murder by poison, such as in the Tylenol case, the writings of Kurt Saxon and his ilk are often a connecting link in the chain.
Kurt, quite frankly, has probably been responsible, and this is just my opinion, but for many, many crimes in this country and elsewhere, by providing people with the technology, with the idea to do something.
About $7.50 a
Kurt
gallon
Saxon appeals to people with grudges. In one of his books, he offers them this word of encouragement. To others, you're a shabby, run-of-the-mill loser. But to yourself, you're a one-man army, with the power to destroy any individual or hundreds in any group. This poor man's James Bond not only has the power to destroy, but to disrupt and terrorize. In the mid-1980s, the writings of Kurt Saxon found their way into the hands of a young man, a would-be survivalist who was every inch the loser to whom Saxon was appealing. His name was David Gray of Aramoana, New Zealand. The morning of November 13th, 1990. In Aramoana, after some early showers, it was a fine late spring day. David Gray rode his bike the 11 kilometres from Aramoana to Port Chalmers to catch a bus for Dunedin. In Hillside Road, Dunedin South, Gray stopped for a late breakfast at the Continental coffee shop. The pie he bought wasn't hot enough for him, and Gray complained bitterly. Soon, irritability turned to anger.
Yes, I asked him to leave, and I walked up towards him. He kept saying to me, "Don't threaten me." And I said, "No one's going to threaten you. I just asked him to leave, and there is the door. Go out." As he went out the door, he turned around and he says, "I'll get you, don't worry, I'll blow you away."
Moments later, a bank security camera recorded the last living images of David Gray making his last withdrawal. Then Gray went into a gun shop. He put a $100 deposit on a .22 rifle. He wanted one modification, a silencer. Ready in 1 week, he was told. "Fine," said Gray, "I'll be back." By mid-afternoon, Gray was on his bike riding back from Port Chalmers to Aramoana. It had been a pretty regular day, a confrontation at the coffee shop, but nothing else extraordinary that we know about for sure. David Gray rode back into Aramoana at about 4:30. His home was at the eastern end of the township. His closest neighbour was Gary Holden, who lived next door with his 2 daughters. Over the years, Holden had tried to befriend Gray, but it hadn't been easy.
They were close friends. Holden had a big dog. This bloke used to take it all over the place, all around the place. And he was associated with Holden a lot, and all of a sudden, boom, something happened.
What the trigger was, we may never know. But early in the evening of Tuesday, November 13th, something inside David Gray snapped. After a disagreement with Gary Holden, Gray went back into his house, fetched some firearms, came back and shot Gary. He pumped 10 bullets into his neighbour's body. It was just before 8 o'clock. Gray then went into Holden's house. He shot and injured Holden's 9-year-old daughter, Chiquita. Although badly hurt, she escaped. Still inside the house, Gray then shot and killed Chiquita's sister Jasmine and her friend Rewa Bryson. He poured petrol through the house and set fire to it. Gray then went on an orgy of killing. As several neighbours rushed to warn each other and raise the alarm, Gray murdered them with his semi-automatic weapons. In quick succession, he shot Vic Crimp, Tim Jamison, James Dixon, and Chris Cole. A utility carrying a local family, the Percys, and 2 other people, stopped outside Gray's home as the killing was underway. Gray shot dead 42-year-old Ross Percy, his wife Vanessa, and their 6-year-old son Dion. Dion's young friend Leo Wilson was also killed. He and Dion had been in the tray of the utility with their bikes. Another passenger from the vehicle, Aleki Tali, aged 41, was the next to die. The only survivor from the ute was the Percy's 2nd child, Stacey. Aged 4, shot in the abdomen, she lay seriously injured in the back of the vehicle. Shortly after this, Port Chalmers Police Sergeant Stu Guthrie moved in on Gray. He loosed off a shot which missed the gunman and was then in turn felled by a bullet from one of Gray's high-powered weapons. The whole nightmare had probably taken a little more than an hour.
We do have fears that what we will find is not particularly good, but we just don't know at this stage.
Yeah, okay. Throughout that night, in the darkness, armed police sought to contain David Gray and to rescue the wounded.
It's a very dangerous situation. We don't want any more fatalities. The police are trying to get into them. It needs a lot of planning, and when we get there, we will certainly be knocking on their door and identifying who we are.
It was a cat-and-mouse game which lasted most of the next day. Just before 6 o'clock, police threw tear gas into a crib. David Gray broke cover. Firing wildly, he shouted to police, "Kill me, kill me." The sounds heard by those watching were the bullets fired by members of the police anti-terrorist squad. Moments later, David Gray was dead.
I have called for a full and comprehensive report surrounding the causes and the effects and the detail, minute by minute, of the total operation, so that we can see in the cold light of day whether or not there are matters that we have to address and whether we've learned something from this operation.
Why, we asked, did one man have so many lethal guns in his home? And what can we do, we wondered, to keep these weapons out of the hands of disturbed people? And then, from inside Gray's crib, we learned about the books. Gray's books on war, weaponry, and killing.
It was a mess. Filthy, dirty, unkempt, Not one bit of order anywhere, except for one place. That was the table and the bookshelves, where he put all his prized possessions, his books about death, about survival, resistance, his books on warfare. And it says to me a lot about his makeup, that in the chaos that surrounded his life, this material like this was the one thing that he could depend on.
And among the neatly numbered collection, the writings of Kurt Saxon. Digging further, correspondence between David Gray and the king of the mayhem manuals. In a letter written 1 year before the massacre, Gray wrote to Saxon sending money for more books and telling Saxon he enjoyed his writings. Gray asked,
"Could you provide information on the 22 as a defence weapon, as it's difficult and expensive to get firearms in this country?"
Saxon wrote back, using the bottom of Gray's letter to him.
"Most any .22 rifle is good. In a pistol, you can't do better than a Ruger, loaded with stingers or Magnum hollow points. Best regards, Kurt Saxon."
Dr. Ian Miller, who's completing a psychological profile on David Gray, is now convinced the links with Kurt Saxon and his writings and other mayhem manuals were a powerful element in the Aramoana Massacre.
Someone like Saxon presents a very, very attractive option. Here's a fellow that says, you know, if you don't like what's happening and people are bad to you, do something about it. But I have no doubt that he sought this literature out, would have continued to seek it out, and it helped him formulate that deadly intent on that fateful evening.
A guess? Supposition on Ian Miller's part? David Gray took the real answer to his grave. But it's possible to start doing some detective work. We'll look next to the United States, to the grim catalogue of death and injury that's occurred where the writings of Kurt Saxon and other mayhem authors have inspired disturbed people like David Gray. And we'll meet the man who told David Gray it was okay to hate and to kill. Here's a sample, testing poison on homeless winos.
Put the dose you want to test in a bottle of wine. Tuck it where the wino will be sure to find it. If the nest has a dead wino in it the next morning, you've figured out the right dose. If both the nest and the bottle are empty, it's back to the old drawing board. Try increasing the dosage.
The worrying part is that Kurt Saxon is absolutely serious.
If somebody read this in your book and followed that advice, you'd consider that they'd followed serious advice.
Well, I think that would be the best test of it because I've known a lot of winos. I used to live at the Wino Arms in Long Beach, California. Most of them were winos. They had no reason for living. They're very miserable people. And if they can be sent off to their happy land with a little dose of something in their wine, what better? Way to go.
You're absolutely serious about that?
Oh, definitely. Why not? If I were a wino living in the gutter, sleeping in little nests like that, and someone helped me out, I'd thank him, if I could.
Harmless nonsense or highly flammable incitement? The question is not just whether Kurt Saxon fired up David Gray of Aramoana, has he inspired others? Neil Livingston says yes. Livingston, who's a Washington-based advisor to kings and presidents on security and a specialist on domestic terrorism, says where you find crime and madmen, you'll find the writings of Kurt Saxon.
This stuff is found in the homes of felons and criminals all over the United States, in the safe houses of hate groups and various terrorist organizations. But we have to assume that if we're seeing this stuff turn up over and over and over again with people who commit crimes or commit some type of heinous action, that it's having an influence on them or instructing them in some way.
There are policemen in big cities like Chicago who agree with Neil Livingston. Cops like Dave Ryan from Chicago's Violent Crime Unit. 9 years ago, Ryan was trying to find the person who'd been lacing Tylenol capsules with cyanide. The poisoner was doing his work with deadly precision. A security camera took pictures of one victim, Paula Prince, as she bought her Tylenol in this Chicago store one afternoon in September 1982. Half an hour after these pictures were taken, the young airline stewardess was dead from from cyanide poisoning. Paula was one of 7 who died from taking contaminated capsules. Although Chicago police never formally charged anyone with the actual poisonings, Dave Ryan and other policemen are convinced that a man who was at one stage a strong suspect in the case is the guilty one. Roger Arnold, now doing time for shooting dead a barman, had a home that was full of the machinery and literature of murder when he was questioned about the Tylenol killings.
We found a large number of weapons, handguns and a carbine, pipe bombs, various chemicals, and we found a book title of The Poor Man's James Bond, and another book titled The Anarchist's Cookbook. Both of these books explained various methods of poisoning people and building explosive devices and things of that nature.
Are there specific enough instructions as to the making of either sodium or potassium cyanide in Mr. Saxon's manual to have given whoever committed the Tylenol poisonings the wherewithal, the knowledge to know what they were doing?
Certainly, yes, there was.
The FBI questioned Kurt Saxon about the Tylenol case and asked for his mailing lists to try to find the killer, but they drew a blank. However, in an edition of The Poor Man's James Bond published after the Tylenol investigation, Saxon wrote concerning his own literature,
Anyone can murder anyone with that book, and I endorse it, and I promote it. I think if you have The Poor Man's James Bond, you can kill anyone you want. That's a great thing.
Now, Saxon says, I was only joking. Why print in your manual, though, how to make potassium cyanide? What possible use is that to anyone other than to a person who wants to do harm to someone else?
Well, if you want to do harm to a Russian, and I don't think the Russian threat is over. The fact that the communist empire has collapsed, that doesn't mean they're not going to take over Europe.
So everything you put in The Poor Man's James Bond, whether explosives, whether poisons, whatever, it's all there to counter the Russian threat?
Or an internal threat.
It's hard to know what threat was in mind when San Diego schoolboys started making these pipe bombs in the mid-1980s.
They were testing these pipe bombs like this, and finally they had one that didn't go off, so they took it back, put it inside their car, and as they were going down the street, it went off and killed the one boy.
Sergeant Conrad Grayson says he's getting tired of picking up bodies and seeing the limbs that are maimed when youngsters experiment with explosives.
We have samples here of what a pipe bomb will shrapnelize and break off, and imagine something this size here traveling at you at the velocity of 3,280 feet per second. It's about 3 times the speed of a .38 bullet, jagged steel.
Such is the handiwork of some San Diego teenagers, sophisticated and horrifying weaponry.
We took this one out of one of our local East County high schools. What boys will do is they'll get a book and they'll cut out the inside and they'll attach a pipe bomb or some type of explosive device into it that when a person opens the book, it actually sets it off.
And where do the ideas come from? Line up some specific bombs with some specific instructions, courtesy of Kurt Saxon. The book bomb, in theory and in practice. A pipe bomb, the Saxon drawing, and the end result. A homemade napalm bomb, just in case the Russians come. For Conrad Grayson, a depressing and recurring pattern, things that go together. Bombs, books, and blasted bodies.
I'm the one that goes to the house and has to talk to the parents. We go to the hospital where these children have lost their fingers, have been crippled, or have been killed. And when we go into their little bedroom, they find these Anarchist Cookbook and James Bond, Poor Man's James Bond books in there, and we figure there is a correlation because this is the only time you find these books is when you've had an explosion in a garage where kids have been dealing with these items.
Such, then, is the legacy of Kurt Saxon to the youth of America and the world. Books which incite the killing of homeless drunks, which instruct readers in the art of cyanide murder, and which elevate homemade bombs into an art form. What's more, books which tell angry and alienated people like David Gray that they can get even. But does Kurt Saxon actually care what happened in Aramoana? The answers we heard were breathtaking. The world of David Gray, where there were no friends and no trust, there was one line of communication that worked. Gray had developed a passion for the writings of Kurt Saxon. He'd seen him mentioned on a television program about survivalists. And finally, he started writing, seeking information about guns.
Reading the letter that he wrote to Saxon and the reply that Saxon wrote back, what do you take from that?
That he was a very disturbed person, that he saw Saxon as a real hope for his expectations.
He writes to Saxon and he says, tell me about the .22 as a defensive weapon. Saxon writes back, what do you make of the interplay between the two of them?
He's seeking approval, he's seeking justification.
Does Saxon give it to him?
I believe so, yes, most certainly.
I reminded Saxon of the 1989 letter from Gray.
David Gray wrote to you and he asked, can you provide information on the .22 as a defence weapon, as it's difficult and expensive to get firearms in this country. You wrote back and you said most any .22 rifle is good.
Yes.
In a pistol you can't do better than a Ruger loaded with stingers or Magnum hollow points.
Well, you see, he had expressed the idea that he couldn't get a higher caliber. But what the Stinger and the Magnum hollow point do is they make it just as good as, say, like a .38.
But you see, here's a guy who's writing to you, and you tell me about your experience in dealing with people in mental institutions and so forth. Isn't there something here which, reading between the lines, is a cry for help from this guy?
Well, he didn't cry for help. He asked me a direct question about a firearm which I was familiar with.
But here is a guy writing from 10,000 miles away in a country in which we just don't need guns to defend ourselves with.
That's right. How did he get the gun? I didn't give it to him.
Could you not have taken the opportunity to say to this young man, hey, what are you worrying about firearms and things for?
No, because he didn't indicate that he felt in danger. See, well, for one thing...
Well, he did indicate he felt in danger. He wanted to know about using a .22 as a defense weapon.
Well, if he were attacked, to hurt the people who attacked him. See? Now, I figured that he's a New Zealander, so he must be rational. I was obviously wrong. I misread it. He was one of the New Zealanders who were crazy.
Like police in New Zealand, Neil Livingston says Gray was not so much crazy as seeking approval. And Kurt Saxon, through his books and his letter, gave him that approval.
Those kind of people see their validation in this kind of literature. They're powerless people. For the most part, they're losers in society. They don't have productive or meaningful jobs. They don't have power over other people. Only by terrorizing other people, only by acquiring weapons and explosives technology, then they can finally feel that they have power, however perverted that may be in their own minds, simply because they have the ability to kill or to terrorize. And I think that Kurt Saxon sends a loud and clear message to those people. And I think that probably many of them look to him as a real spiritual leader.
There are other communities where lives have been lost at the hands of people who've been taught how to hate. In Seattle on Christmas Eve 1985, a disturbed young man called David Rice attacked a family of 4 in their home. He tied up his victims, anesthetized them, then bludgeoned and stabbed them repeatedly. All 4 died. It would later emerge that David Rice, filmed here in prison, had been quietly going crazy on a steady diet of mayhem literature, the writings of the likes of Kurt Saxon. Rice had become so deluded he believed communist forces were massing on the Canadian border, ready to invade. He killed the family because he believed they were communists. They were not. Rice had been living out a fantasy, primed up by far-right literature. That's the firm view of Dr. Kenneth Muscatel, court-appointed psychologist in the case.
This kind of literature potentiates and makes an individual, as you're describing, more likely to act in this way simply because it validates what may be paranoid and hostile feelings and impulses which already exist, but makes them more real and gives them some substance and focus.
Substance and focus. Is that what happened at Aramoana too? As David Gray read those words, the poor man's James Bond has the power to destroy any individual or hundreds in any group. Did he read that, and did he take up the challenge?
Now, isn't it entirely conceivable that David Gray read that and said, yes, that's me and I'm going to do it?
Well, it may have, but you see, if he read that and took that from it, then he needed more help than that I could give him.
But he took your advice. He
not necessarily. How do you know? That's a conjecture on your part, and it's easy for you to come to. But I've dealt with more people like that than you have.
But you said a moment ago he may have, and even if he may have, isn't that an enormous indictment of the sorts of things that you write and disseminate?
Not necessarily, because in most cases these people would have been better off dead. David Gray, if society wasn't going to help him, it should have put him to sleep.
So reading The Poor Man's James Bond, even though you don't admit that it was a cause, if reading that helped put him to sleep, that was a good thing.
Well and good.
A couple of young kids died in Aramoana at the hands of David Gray. You said you didn't feel any responsibility for his death. Do you feel for them?
No. I can't do it. Does Bush feel responsibility for the suffering and misery he's caused in the Middle East?
George Bush went to throw out an invader. That wasn't what happened in Aramoana.
Well, it may have been, but why weren't the people in Aramoana looking after David? Why was he free?
By this stage in the interview, we'd concluded that there'll be no remorse from this man for any of the hurt he's accused of having inspired. Hearing Saxon's remarks convinces New Zealand police psychologist Ian Miller that Saxon knows he has the blood of many people on his hands.
Communities are always going to have their misfits. There are always going to be problems with communities. That's the nature of human beings. But to publicly, internationally publish the machinery, the methods, the knowledge of how to kill people, and to justify it. I mean, you read his books, he makes comments about getting rid of lowlife, of scum, of liberals, and so many other things. He's clearly anti-Semitic. He's clearly racist. That, to me, is just giving a written license for people looking for a cause to go out and act in a homicidal, instructive manner. He pulls the trigger just as surely as David Gray.
So, what to do about mayhem literature? Its easy availability in US bookstores owes much to the First Amendment to the American Constitution, which guarantees there are no easy answers to either problem. In July 1984, James Huberty, a security guard who'd just been sacked, shot and killed 21 people at a McDonald's restaurant in San Ysidro, California. They pulled down the McDonald's and set up a centre of learning and a monument. But for all that, we still don't really understand mass murderers like James Huberty of San Ysidro or David Gray of Aramoana. From what we now know about David Gray, was he certifiably mad?
Very difficult to answer that. There's no history that we can pinpoint, any history of treatment or assessment. My gut feeling is that were he to survive that incident, it may be that he wasn't found psychotic, in other words, certifiable. He would certainly have been found disturbed. It would become a very interesting issue for the forensic specialist to decide whether he was indeed mad in the classical sense or whether he was bad in the classical sense. I would, of course, favour the psychological disturbance view rather than the criminal view.
As Gray was growing up, at least one teacher worried about what he might become.
He was like a frightened rabbit. If you ever confronted him, he completely lost control.
And that could arise in a flash?
Yes. Yes, it was never premeditated, but, you know, it was like one of these frightened animals. If you corner them, they completely become irrational and lose control, and that is what I felt must have happened in the Aramoana thing. Even now, I think it's very difficult to get help for kids like that. I have had subsequent children, and it wasn't till we threatened to actually expel two pupils of mine subsequently in intermediate school situations that we actually did get help from the psychological service. Now, I'm told it's different now. I do wonder. I don't know.
In summary, then, although Gray had once sought medical help for depression and had a reputation for being strange, no one knew he had a house packed with guns. No one expected his rage to turn murderous. What's more, up and down the length of the country, there are towns which have their local eccentrics. In some cases, people more unusual than Gray, but they never hurt anyone. On the question of guns, New Zealand had ironically started banning the import of assault rifles like the one that David Gray used 5 months before Aramoana. After the massacre, the police hardly had to defend the ban.
All over the world, where these type of incidents occur, a person going on a rampage, blackened face, military-type clothing or anything like that, the person has chosen one of those military look-alike, usually the AK-47 type weapon to do it, and that indicates to me there's something there that it helps to trigger something within the mind of such a person.
More restrictions may be on the way. One proposal, that gun owners should have to license all their weapons as well as themselves. Tougher rules bring tough talk from the gun lobby. Their argument, guns don't kill people, people kill people. But would David Gray have been as lethal if armed with a knife instead of one of these? Ian Miller very much doubts it.
A gun is a highly efficient killing instrument.
Enemies, stoked into action by mayhem literature, has exacted a heavy toll. Whether it's survivalists like the pair who committed suicide in Missouri rather than surrender their weapons, or whether it's people who kill police officers while running guns to survivalist compounds. It's a cult which costs lives. We made one last visit to a place which in its own way bears scars as deep as those inflicted on Aramoana. This used to be a survivalist compound. Here, with recipes supplied by Kurt Saxon, they mixed poison, tested booby traps, and hoarded weapons, pictured here along with their copy of the poor man's James Bond. In its heyday in the early 80s, this compound in northern Arkansas was home for several hundred people, including scores of children. When the FBI raided here in 1985 after the murder of 2 state troopers, the occupants fled. All those little shoes, you find yourself wondering, where did all those little feet go? What do those children think of the outside world they've been taught to fear and arm against? And will the pain of Aramoana one day be visited on some other community because of what was bred, even in the schoolhouse, into some other youngster? All hard questions. What we do know from Aramoana and lots of other places is that where you find the words, you so often find the wounds.
David Gray, whose home and legacy are now just so many ashes, sought the advice of Kurt Saxon one last time before he died. Ironically, while we were in Harrison, Arkansas, the last book that Saxon sent Gray came back in the mail. The envelope marked, "Return to sender, deceased." The book, like what passes for concern from Kurt Saxon, arrived in Aramoana too late. Saxon also showed us one last horrifying letter, which would seem to give the lie to everything he says about his books doing no harm. It's a letter from a young man called Tim in the American state of Ohio, a man who reads Kurt Saxon's books religiously. Tim writes, "Dear Kurt, could you tell me the best way to administer poison gases? The main thing is, the method has to be quiet. Also, what's the terriblest poison you know of? One that causes an agonizing death. How do you make it? And how much is a lethal dose? And is there anything you can give to someone who has diabetes that will make their diabetes bad enough to kill them?" Saxon admits he knows Tim from Ohio. He says he's a weird kind of guy, and he's made a couple of bombs already. Nevertheless, Saxon wrote to Tim and told him everything he wanted to know.
In his most recent book, before we told him how David Gray's life had ended, Kurt Saxon wrote, "After selling over 50,000 copies of the poor man's James Bond, there has not been one report of any youngster hurting himself or anyone else. You can be sure the media would love to smear me with the story of one of my young readers destroying all forms of life in his neighborhood. Even so, it wouldn't bother me unless I lived in that unfortunate community."